that value has now moved up to 82.14%. As mentioned in the last meeting, we had a low in October of 32.8%. This is a 16.7% increase from last month. So I think there's some real improvement in regards to that area, and it's going in the right direction. And then CRP 126, which relates to the number of missed collections per 100,000. Last month in December, in the report, that was a further 8 higher than this level, which is the lowest level it's been set since I've been here in 2019 at 44.48%. And it's also quite important because this is following Christmas collections. So this is part of the extended collections over post-Christmas period. So I think that's a really good performance in respect to that. And then there is SP032 in relation to the parks, which is number of green flags. Just wanted to prime the panel in terms of the number of ambitious green flags we're going for this year, which will increase by another 3, hopefully, as we're putting the cannons, Hayden Road Recreation Ground, as well as Canizaro Park forward. We've made those applications in January of this year, so hopefully they'll bear fruit and we'll exceed that target. Thank you very much, Chair.
Great, thank you very much, John. Are there any questions, anything that John mentioned, or any other statistics that people noticed in the reports? Oh, Vicky?
Thanks, Chair. Just the final one, the SP 518 rent reviews, the quarterly measure, the value is 9 and the target is 32. Just interested to understand a bit more about that and what it relates to and if that's a problem.
Thank you, Councillor. I can go through the other sustainable communities ones as well, but in terms of rent reviews, that is slightly behind at the moment. The team is down by 1 member of staff, so the rent reviews are running a bit slower than we normally anticipate this time of year.
Any other questions to John? Dan?
Question on waste services in terms of FPNs paid. That number seems to be a red item, and wondering what's happening. Why are people not paying their fines?
Thank you very much, Chair. In terms of that question, this is on the month of January. It takes a 3-month lag period to fully realize the FPN process. It's probably not a good metric in that target. The target is for over the course of that whole FPN lifespan to get more than 70% in terms of payment. So it's probably a bit too close. After that stage of non-payment, we would go into the single justice process. Probably need a lag of up to 3 months to realize the full effect of that FPN process. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for John? And if not, then we'll move into our first item today. So on the call-in for the traveller site and the review of the licence fee, just to give an indication of well, John, you mind just turning your microphone off for a second? So just to give an indication, I'm going to pass over to Samantha to give just about an overview of why they did call the decision in and their thoughts. I said about 6 minutes before. I'm not going to be keeping a strict time. If I start looking at you and suggestively lifting my eyebrows or something, it probably means it's time to wind up. And then I'll pass over to officers to give their perspective, and then the panel, the floor will be open for questions to both of you. So if I could pass it to you, Samantha.
Right, we've called in this decision as we believe that 2 principles of decision making have not been applied. Namely, A, respect for human rights and equalities, and B, consideration and evaluation of alternatives. Brickfields is a traveller site in Wimbledon Park Ward, over which the council retain ownership, but it is managed by Clarion, who charge a licence fee to the occupants of the site. The management agreement does not simply allow Clarion to set an amount, and presumably if that had been the intention, That is what would have been stipulated. The management agreement at 6.1 sets out the council will set a weekly licence fee as recommended by Clarion, acting reasonably. Merton at 6.2 are required to review the licence fee at least annually and notify Clarion. Therefore, it would seem to us that there is an expectation that the council would look at the situation, negotiate with Clarion and come to a decision, but also it would look at its own actions and what else it could do. So on consideration of equalities, the equalities assessment process requires that the council look at the potentially negative impacts of its decision and take steps to mitigate them, including a wide range of actions and alternatives. Travellers are one of the most discriminated against groups nationally and internationally. This surely means the council should be especially careful in its consideration of equality's impact. However, the council did not consider equality at all. It states that at para 8 of the decision report, while the decision sheet confirms that the decision report was the only document relied upon. The council did prepare an equalities analysis after the call-in, which did report an equality impact, which incidentally under para 7 betrays a lack of understanding of the concept of indirect discrimination. But why was that EA not considered as part of the decision? The council claimed they did not need to do so because, as is normal with government initiatives, the government conducted an EA. However, this never usually precludes the council conducting a local one, whilst the national one was clearly not relied upon, as it is not referenced in the decision. On proper consideration of alternatives, it appears from para 3 of the decision report that the council basically accepted the 7% increase recommended by Clarion and didn't question or negotiate. It interpreted the rent cap set by the government as an absolute requirement rather than the maximum that the rent can be increased by. Now, there are various other options open to the council. They could have chosen to negotiate about the correct increase for Clarion to recommend, given that a management arrangement of a traveller's site is different to a social housing facility. For example, with social housing, Clarion's responsibilities extend to maintaining the value of the real estate rather than just managing the site. If the council did not want to negotiate and just concede the maximum 7% increase, they still could have looked at the management contract and visited the site to see whether Clarion are upholding their obligations to manage with, quote, reasonable skill, care and diligence, section 3.1 of the management agreement, or whether adequate fire protection equipment is being provided at section 4.1. I have visited the site and spoken to residents, and I do not believe that either of the above obligations are being upheld in light of a chronic rat infestation, failure to maintain running water to every pitch, and disconnected firefighting equipment. Given the council state in their belated equalities analysis that the rent increase supports Clarion's ability to carry out the terms of the management agreement, why didn't the council consider the alternative of requiring that this was done before agreeing the increase? The council should also have considered some of the alternatives suggested in the EA guidelines. These guidelines state, amongst other things, that the council should identify actions to prevent inequality and promote equality, provide concessionary rates or additional services for some groups, and put ongoing monitoring arrangements in place. However, no such conditions have been mandated. And more tellingly, it does not appear from the decision report or the call-in report that any of these possibilities were even considered. Para 4 of the decision report and the call-in report states that Clarion have consulted the council on the level of the new licence fee. That consultation appears to consist of 2 emails, one from Merton asking what the proposed increase would be, and one from Clarion telling them. In summary, sending an email to Clarion asking how much they want to raise the rent, checking that that is in line with the government cap, fails to fulfil the council's duty under para 6.1 to ensure Clarion are acting reasonably, and para 6.2 to review the licence fee annually. We think that to fulfil their duties, the council should have conducted an equalities analysis beforehand and sought to address the issues that it raises rather than conducting a flawed one afterwards, examined whether Clarion were acting reasonably in increasing rent, given their many failures listed above, and considered alternatives to simply agreeing the increase by negotiating with Clarion to ensure that any agreement to increase the rent was conditional on these failings being immediately addressed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. If I could wrap us off to John and Elliot.
Thank you, Councillor MacArthur, for your presentation. I won't go through the entire document again, and you've alluded to most of the sections, but what I will say, of course, is that the stock transfer agreement to Clarion for the Travellers site was a 30-year agreement from 2010 to 2040. And within that agreement, and I'll refer you to point 2.4 in our updated document, is part of the stock transfer agreement. The first 5 years, there was a promise not to increase rents by more than the standard homes and communities formula. And then after that, there was still a requirement to review the rent annually. The formula that used is the HCA government's regulator formula. That's been adopted, and that resulted in between 2016 and 2019 of rent decreases for all Clarion properties, including the Travellers site. Also, inflation is running at 10.1 to 11.1% when this formula was looked at, and the government re-looked at that formula in consultation with stakeholders and with the RPs, and decided on a maximum lower formula, and the increase is capped to 7%. So when this was presented to me on the 10th of February as the key officer and the lead member, who this authority is delegated to, I looked at the reasonableness of this request. I met with the key officers in person and went through in detail why the rent increase was 7%. And in my view, the rent increase wasn't reasonable based on the government formula, based on the level that RPI was currently running at. In my view, the decision wasn't reasonable, and that's why I took the decision in conjunction with the lead member to agree it and sign it. The Travellers site has got 15 sites. In the last 5 years, since the records have been monitored, there's not one issue of one traveller had any problems with paying the rent. There are systems in place. Clarion have a specialist team to be able to go out and assist people to apply for benefits, to maximise their incomes if there are any problems with rent. That team is a very robust team and would be called upon if needed if there were any problems, which in the last 5 years, there have been none. That was all that I've got to update. The papers are there. Oh, around the EIA, we did complete one. We did complete one subsequently. There wasn't one completed beforehand, and that is, as you've alluded to, because there was a national one done by government, and we utilised that. You are right, we should have mentioned it in the paper, and apologies that we didn't. We have subsequently completed the EIA, which is now in your pack.
Thanks so much, John. So now if I could open the floor to any questions the panel members have. So are there any thoughts that people want to contribute? Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. Two quick questions to start with, if I may. 6.4 of the agreement talks about a review. And I wondered if you could outline where in the material before us, you know, what is that review and what is it for? And 6.2 says that it should be notified to Clarion. Where did that happen? So that's one of my questions. And my second question is about the government's equality assessment of the rent cap. Now, you've alluded to it, although in the decision report it doesn't state it's there. In fact, it states the opposite, that no other documents were used. What did that say about Travellers sites? Obviously, the rent cap largely affects social housing tenants. Travellers sites are in a slightly different position, and I wondered what that equality assessment says about Travellers.
The review has taken place every year following the regulator's formula, and the fact that it was as part of the stock transfer agreement, it was necessary to have an annual rent review, and the review for the first 5 years was taking it to be the regulator's standard formula, and subsequently every year since then, with every director and every decision made of every year, the idea that it was stipulated that they had to act reasonably, and adopting the regulator's formula was considered every year is considered to be reasonable. So that's the reason why we come to 7%. It's not because each year we negotiate with them to bring it up or down or change that value, because they make a recommendation to us and it's set down in the legal document, the fact that actually if they're acting reasonably, then the council must adopt it. So given the fact that they've adopted the regulator's formula every year, that's the formula which we've adopted with them. And with regards to the rent cap at 7%, that's the formula which they're applying across all of their stock, and so that's the flat rate across for the site too.
Great, thank you, Anthony.
May I follow up quickly? Thank you for that. It's not entirely the question. It's not the answer to the question that I asked, and I probably just wasn't clear. So 6.2 said the license fee shall be reviewed at least annually by the council and notified to the company. What is it that's notified to, what do you do that you then notify to the company? Because I can't see that in this paper. So it envisaged that something happens, a review, which we might expect to be a report or a document of some kind, that then would be communicated to Clarion. That's what it says, but I can't see that here. So I was wondering what I'm not understanding. And my second point was, you've referred explicitly to the equality analysis that the government did of the rent cap. What does that equality analysis say about traveller sites?
Okay. So the management agreement doesn't prescribe the method in which we give the feedback to the housing association. So what it does say is that the company needs to come to the council to make the recommendations, and the council needs to approve it. So subsequently, for the first few years, that decision was made directly by the Director of Community and Housing when Simon Williams was here, and then subsequently it's been published up on the website as a non-key decision in order to provide transparency in the decision making. And as soon as that decision is made, then we just email Clarion to say that that's been approved. They make their proposal. We document the decision making as part of the council's businesses, and then we notify them to say that they're allowed to make the decision. I mean, they have been notified to say that they're not allowed to make the decision currently. So that they are on a warning. So we haven't agreed that. And then the EIA, it doesn't specifically mention traveller sites. It talks about single parents. It talks about ethnic minorities, but it doesn't specifically go on to say how one is more disadvantaged than the other. So it goes on to reference the fact that some people may be challenged by it, but it doesn't specifically have mitigating actions or make any suggestions as to how we might do that. And we adopt the mitigating actions by the fact that they are the licensees on site are supported by means of a tenancy sustainment team, and they are supported by in order to claim any benefits which they may need on their pitch, which of course is provided by the council, or in some cases other benefits.
Cool. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. This is a question to those who brought the call in, so Councillor MacArthur and Councillor Fairclough. assuming you have a particular aim of this, what is it you actually want in this panel to sort of recommend? Because at some point, if we were to agree, we'd have to have a actual decision and recommendation to put back to cabinet members. So specifically, what is it? Because the if it is just to do the EIA beforehand, well, it's too late. That's already been and gone. Is it? Are you looking for a different percentage rent, or are you looking to change the conditions? I'm not actually quite clear what you're seeking as an outcome.
Well, personally, I would like things like the site to be visited, and before they say 7% increase, they say the conditions which are in the management agreement are met, so that the things which they are supposed to be doing, they do before you just say here's 7% increase. Because I think in any other company, if somebody was managing it and they weren't managing it properly, you wouldn't just give them an increase. You would say, please, could you do what you're supposed to do? They're not. I don't know if it's been checked, but I've visited, and the things that they are supposed to do under the management agreement are not being done. And that is what I would like to see. I would like to see that stipulated as being done.
Thank you for that. So that alludes to the fact that there was no visits at all. Then I would have thought visits to sites like any other Clarion site will be like a site in the state inspection or visits to check these things. Are you saying that's not happening?
So I was saying from the council's perspective, Clarion do visit. I was saying the council should be enforcing the points that they're in the contract, the council and Clarion. Clarion aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. The council should be saying, as managers, you're not managing the site properly. That's what I think should happen. Clarion do visit.
Great. Any other questions? I may take Stephen, and then we'll go to Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. Superficially, having only just read it whilst we're in the meeting and slightly beforehand, superficially to me, it doesn't look unreasonable, the decision that's been taken by the officers, or the submission that was made by Clarion, though I understand that it may not be technically correct if I looked at it more carefully. But I'd like to ask the officers if the submission that's been put forward by Councillor MacArthur, that the premises are not fulfilling the obligations of the agreement, in other words, that the tenants are not getting what they expect, whether those arguments are agreed or not, because it would be useful for us to know if the property is not being run as it should be, because then I think there's a much stronger argument, which I think has been submitted, that there might, for example, be a delay in the increase, or that Clarion might be criticised in some way if they're not actually providing what they should.
To Anthony's question, and then to officers.
It's more of a comment, if I may, although officers may wish to come back on it. And also to come back a little bit on Councillor Holden's point. In my view, and I hope the council's, it's not simply good enough to do the equality assessment afterwards. Some of this is also about perception. The equality assessment guidance says that EAs are an integral part of a decision-making process. We've heard that an EA was not an integral part of this decision-making process. I've had officers from the LGA looking for the government's rent cap quality assessment. It's practically impossible to find. Officers have kindly referred to it, but they've also highlighted that it says nothing about travellers' sites, which do have different considerations. And their own equality assessment indicates there are equality impacts. The equality assessment guidance suggests a number of alternatives that could be considered as part of the equality assessment process, like, for example, provision of additional information to people claiming benefits. For example, do we know whether the uptake of benefits amongst the traveller community is the same, higher, lower than the general community? Is there a need for additional information, for example? All this should have taken part in the decision in the equality assessment, and then appropriate mitigation put in place before the decision was made. That could still lead to a decision if the panel thinks 7% is reasonable, although I would argue that 7% when you're maintaining a building is different to 7% when you're maintaining a site for pitches. I think the other point is we've heard, that the agreement talks about a review. Well, we've heard what the nature of that review is. That is a general assumption that a decision in line, I should highlight it's a cap as well. It's not a recommendation or a requirement of government. It is in fact a cap. But we've heard that the review is essentially, as long as Clarion say it's in line with the government's formula, they're okay with it. I'm not sure that's what the management agreement envisages. It envisages something more substantive, and that's essentially Councillor MacArthur and Councillor Hall's point, that there should have been something more substantive. I don't believe, you know, there's no ill will, and I'm not criticising officers, but I don't believe there was any thought as in this decision as to whether the services in Schedule 1 to the agreement were being provided appropriately when this decision was made. This decision was the cap is 7%, Clarion are asking for 7%, job done. You know, it's a little bit more complex than that. I appreciate, and we've heard from you know, the director that he quizzed the officers, although there's nothing in the pack about that, about whether that figure was reasonable. But I think that's more an answer to Councillor Holden's point about why it's not enough just to say, well, now we've done the equality assessment, we see that the decision would have been the same. Well, maybe it would and maybe it wouldn't, but we'll never know because we didn't. And actually, it's not unreasonable, even if we think we'd get the same decision, to say we don't think it was done right, we want it done properly, and maybe we'll come up with some different mitigations and some other things that you might think about in light of the discussion we've had here. Sorry, it was a bit of a comment.
I mean, for this one, I might just turn to Martin's point and then bring in Officer.
Obviously, I obviously hear concerns from Councillor MacArthur about the site. I'd just obviously like to ask officers how much correspondence have they had from the Wimbledon Park councillors and also the cabinet member in relation to these concerns, because obviously they raised them. Obviously, we've got that statutory responsibility. It obviously would be quite helpful from an officer perspective, and whether you've also had any correspondence from users of the site as well about Clarion's management.
We have had no concerns raised through our housing enforcement team or through any member about this site. This is the first time that we've heard there's been an issue. And of course, now I've heard this, we will go back to Clarion and we'll speak to our housing enforcement team to see if a visit is needed. And we'll do that as soon as possible. Again, back to the increases. I need to stress this has been going on for a number of years. It is only a larger amount this year because of the inflation. We are running at 10–11% inflation. And the reasonableness was that the government in consultation have reduced that down to a maximum of 7%. The previous years, as I stated, for 3 years in a row, Clarion actually reduced the rent during that same formula. Last year, when inflation wasn't running at the same amount, the increase was 5.1%. So I still think the decision is reasonable and it was the right decision to make. It's an industry-wide regulator. It isn't specifically for merit for Clarion or for, it's all RPs adopt a similar standard. There is nothing out with what other RPs, other housing providers are doing. And I still think it's a reasonable decision. But we will, now that that has been raised, officers will speak to Clarion and we will get the housing enforcement team to go out and do a visit as well.
So I think we might just go for, I'll just say one last, there's actually a few more people that want to speak. I'm going to go to Andrew and then Jill's waiting online and then we'll go to you.
I was consulted by officers about the making of this decision. I was quite satisfied that fairness was at the heart of their consideration. In terms of the management agreement, it couldn't be less than 7%. It couldn't be fair to the travellers to have it more than the social rent that's being set for Clarion and for other housing associations. Therefore, 7% appeared to be fundamentally fair. I don't think there is a difference, actually, in terms of inflation. Inflation is faced by people who are socially renting. It's faced by travellers. And there are inflationary costs to managing sites as there are to managing housing. So I don't think there's any obvious distinction that can be made on that basis. But thank you very much, Councillor MacArthur, for the inspection that you've made at the site and for your information that there's been a rat problem, and also that some of the pitches have not had water supplied. And as has been mentioned by Mr. Morgan, we will follow that up with Clarion, if necessary, by a visit to the site, to ascertain if there are ongoing issues that we need to raise on a continuing basis with Clarion until they're resolved.
Thanks, Roger. So how many people wanted to still ask a question? Cool. Okay, so if we go to Jill next, and then we'll go to Samantha.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for not being present this evening. Just some observations here. It's a well-known fact, and I'm sure the council officers will back me up in environmental health, that you're never more than 6 feet away from a rat, two-legged or four-legged, in this country. So just bear that in mind when you're an open land site. Secondly, if Clarion has the major responsibility in maintenance, then surely we need to call them in and scrutinise them on this. So in other words, I'd like to see a report from them, and a full report, and maybe that's something we could bring back to scrutiny at some point. Secondly, I'm assuming that the rents that they charge for a pitch on a site like this does not remotely compare to the rent for bricks and mortar, and therefore a 7% increase on what is quite possibly, I would imagine, a far reduced amount where they can in fact claim the increase under the housing benefit scheme. I don't consider this particularly unfair or directed specifically at a minority group. That's how I see it. But I would like to thank the officers who are being called in this evening to deal with this issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jill. And I can pass over to Sam.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to Councillor Welton's point. I have actually contacted the council, but not about housing, about rubbish collection, which wasn't collected for a long time. I have contacted Clarion on a number of occasions about the site, and on all but one, nothing has happened, and I've had to follow it up. So it's not a case that it's not being followed up, but a case that Clarion are not responding, and that is why I find it frustrating that they are just being told they can increase the rent by 7% and not being held to account for the management agreement, which they are not following through on.
Great. And before officers in, maybe we'll just take a few more questions, and then we'll bring this to a decision. So it may go to Victoria, and then to Stephen, and then to Dan to have the final word.
I'm still not quite clear on why it's 7% for these sites and social housing if Clarion's responsibilities are different. I think John said that it's kind of common across the piece with housing associations, but I'm just interested to know, is that number always set the same for the different types of properties across the piece as well? Because yeah, my understanding is that, pardon? Oh, okay. It's just, yeah, I'm just unclear, because I feel like Clarion have less responsibility, but they're charging the same amount in terms of increase, and that doesn't quite make sense to me, but grateful for clarifications.
Thanks, Victoria. Then we go to Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. It's just, I don't know what the appropriate point is, but it seemed to me that we should have a recommendation from this, that there is an inspection along the lines that the cabinet member and the officer has suggested, so that we can see if there is really any problem in the premises provided.
Thanks, Stephen. And then Dan, I can go for you for the final word.
Yeah, thank you. One of the points raised by those calling in decision was about alternatives and whether they'd been assessed. So the obvious thing would be how do you assess the cost for, let's say, the traveller site versus a normal Clarion site, and also how does the pitch costs compare to similar ones in neighbouring boroughs? So those would be the obvious things to look at as alternatives, rather than just going straight to the 7%.
Great. So sorry, John. I've a lot of questions there, so get track of some of those. But yeah, good luck. We're not familiar with the cost of pitches in neighbouring boroughs, but we can make some inquiries. With regards to the cost of the pitch was set by the council at the time of the stock transfer, and at the time
it was the council's standard cost. And as a result of the stock transfer agreement, the council agreed to increase it every single year by the standard formula for the first 5 years, and then continue to adopt that subsequently. And in support of what other people have said, whilst the cost of bricks and mortar or other sites might be different, it doesn't negate the fact that there's still an inflationary pressure on managing the site, and that's what, as part of our management agreement, we're due to be compliant with the fact that Clarion will need their inflationary increase in order to manage the site and manage their business.
Do you have any other comments or any other questions that were mentioned? I think Victoria had a question, and Sam brought up some points as well.
I think the question for Victoria was around why are we adopting the same formula year in, year out? Because that was the agreement at the time when the stock transfer, at the time when the management agreement was set up in place. And so each year, because the inflationary pressures on rents have been set by the regulator and were adopted by the council, the regulators' rates were adopted by the council for the first 5 years and have subsequently continued to be adopted by the regulator. Then that's what's carried on to be deemed as reasonable as an inflationary increase each year. But as we say, also there's been those years when there's been no increase, where Clarion have reduced the rents in accordance with the regulators. So it's just deemed to be a reasonable increase, and that's the argument for it.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think is a very quick point. I think. Sure.
So I'd like that to ask the panel to consider that this call-in has been made out for the following reasons. If the agreement said Clarion can set the amount, and that was it, then I think that's absolutely fine. It doesn't say that. What it says is that Clarion will make a recommendation, which must be reasonable, and that the council will review and report back to Clarion. And we've heard that there was no review of substance. The review was essentially that brief exchange of emails in Appendix 3. We've also heard that there was no equality impact assessment at the time, which is described as an integral part of our decision-making process. And I do think it's important that we stand and we say, actually, especially when you're considering groups of people who historically are very, very discriminated against in lots of ways, I do think it would set down a marker that we haven't carried out an equality impact assessment. And I think if we had, we'd have come up with some of the alternatives. That process would have come up with some of the alternatives, which actually are around things that the council can do. It may be that the council cannot move beyond the 7% that Clarion recommend, but it could be the council could have considered whether to use its cost of living fund, for example, to assist if anybody needs it, or to provide additional information, or indeed to speak to some of the tenants of the pitches, which it hasn't done. I think those things would have been drawn out by the equality process. That hadn't happened, and for that reason, I think we should accept this call-in as valid and ask the decision to be made again with a revised equality impact assessment that maybe looks at some of those alternatives. I think that rectifies it, and that's what I'd like to ask the panel to do. We've also heard evidence that there are problems. The review is the council's opportunity to perform its management function, and that isn't happening. You know, fantastic. The council's now going to, the cabinet member and the council are now going to go and investigate it. But actually, this should happen automatically through the review process. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So I mean, I think we'll go to a vote on this now, and just mostly I'd like to thank some for bringing that forward, and I think it is positive that John and Andrew have heard about the situation that might be with some of what people are going through on that site, and making sure those things are addressed. And so I don't think we need a proposal or seconder for this because this is already, this is the calling. Yeah. And so if I could a show of hands for all those in favour of referring the decision back to the executive director. 3. All those against? All those not voting? Did you get that, Rosie? So don't be too fast there.
No, 3, 6, 3, 6, 1.
I think that was right. 3, 6, right. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So that decision won't be referred back to the cabinet member, but I would be great to make sure that that site visit is carried out soonish so that we can find out how the situation is on those sites.
Yeah.
So it's obviously your decision, Chair, but my suggestion is that we put a recommendation that the director and the cabinet member arrange for inspection of the site to explore the issues raised by the councillors who submitted the call-in.
I mean, it's something that they're going to do anyway, but I don't think there's any harm in having. So, Dan? Yeah, sure. Great. Okay. Well, if Rosie, are you clear on the wording for that? Great. Okay. So, all those in favour? All those against or not voting? I think unanimous. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Stephen. Great. Okay, so now if we could move on to the next item. So like I said, we're going to switch these around a little bit and take the piece on planning enforcement now. And so I think Jonathan Berry's kindly joining us here this evening to talk us through this. So John, if I could pass over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everybody. So, yes, I'll just talk through the report that's before you this evening. This follows a motion by the council back in 2021 and then a report to this panel in 2022 that wanted to see some improvement and new direction in the planning enforcement service. And the purpose of this update tonight is to let members know what's happened in the meantime. The recommendation is that the report is noted by the panel. And first of all, I'd like to say that it is really great the interest that I've experienced in the planning enforcement service since I joined last June. It's clearly a very sensitive and an important issue for members. We can see that in the number, it's reflected in the members' inquiries that we get and the number of complaints that we register. And so there are various things that we've done since the concerns were first raised. And I think it would help if I just set the national picture very, very briefly and perhaps added a comment about our service against the points made, just to give you a flavour of where I think we're up to today. So the Royal Town Planning Institute produced a report in November 2022. And I think the title of the report sums up the planning enforcement picture across the United Kingdom. It was entitled "The Scale and Nature of Resourcing Challenges Faced by Enforcement Teams." And a survey was done of 103 authorities. And the conclusion really is that there's a bit of a crisis in the service nationwide. And some of the key points made were that 90% of the authorities surveyed felt that they were experiencing a backlog. And of course, when the motion was made by the council at Merton, we had over 900 cases registered, which is way too many. And the target was set that by the end of 2022, that would be halved essentially to 450 cases. I'm pleased to say that we're down to now between 300 and 350 cases. So we've exceeded the target and got the workload down considerably below that. And I would say really that in my view, we don't really have a backlog now at Merton. I think that is essentially business as usual, and things seem to have really settled down. So another finding of the Royal Town Planning Institute was that 80% of authorities didn't feel that they had enough officers to get through the workload. Well, there are lots of reasons why we have around 300 cases on the books at any one time, and that's because the planning enforcement process can take a long time for lots of different reasons. We can end up in court, we can end up at appeal. Either of those processes can take over a year. So you always expect to have quite a large number of cases on the books, and it's how you get through them. And at the moment, things have really settled down. So since we got the backlog down to around 300, we're essentially receiving 20 to 30 cases that we need to investigate each month, and we're getting through a similar number. So the backlog's not increasing again, it's staying fairly constant. The number of cases are staying fairly constant. We've been able to do that because 70% of the authorities interviewed by the National Institute, they said that they'd had difficulties recruiting in the last 5 years. And we have had that problem too. But what we have managed to do is bring in agency staff, and especially an enforcement manager. And he's really been able to direct the team and settle things down and really get stuck into that backlog. So I think we've met our overall aim to start with. That was stage one, if you like, and perhaps the most important aspect of the service that we needed to resolve. So we do still have an issue with financing. Agency staff do not come cheap, and 43%, well, there's been a 43% fall in planning resources basically over the last 10 to 15 years nationwide. So we're not the only ones experiencing that. But now we need to move into stage two of the improvements. And what we have prepared now is a proposed planning structure, planning enforcement structure, a staff structure to present to the incoming executive director, who starts on the 9th of May. So we've got a proposed structure in mind. We've got a new local enforcement plan drafted that will set standards for the service and how we envisage the service will perform moving forward. We've very recently had an audit, a piece of audit work concluded. Well, almost, it's in draft form. I'm expecting the final report anytime now. There's just a final bit of consultation going on. But the South West London auditors have completed their review of the service, and we're about to get those findings. So they will give recommendations. On the whole, I gather that will conclude that so far stage one has been successful, and we're in a much better position now. And it's about the more detailed, finer aspects of performance that we need to focus on next. So that would be my summary of where we are today, Chairman.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. I don't know, maybe Andrew, if you want to add anything on what John just said.
No, it's clearly very important. I've noted that since John has been in charge, that I think a number of the concerns have reduced considerably, and there's been some very deft and skillful handling of planning enforcement cases across the piece. So my thanks to John and to Raymond as head of the planning enforcement team and all the officers working there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. So are there any questions to put to John? Dan, any other questions? I think Dan and Anthony, and then we'll go to Martin.
Yes, thank you, John. It's a good improvement in the numbers. Plan enforcement is one of those areas I've banged on about for many, many years. So my first question would be, of those 350 sort of remaining backlog ones, how many are long-term ones that have been on the books for, let's say, 1.5 years, 2 years? Because historically, some used to remain churning over for years, and there was only the easy ones that got dealt with. So how many of the difficult ones or long-term ones have you got left? And secondly, how do you actually let people know when a decision is made? Because quite often the residents or whoever raised the query or councillors, we're not always told what the outcome is and why it's been made the way it has. So sometimes if we were told, that could help bring it down sooner and quicker, the numbers, because at least then we'd know we wouldn't then put in a repeated request.
Thanks, Dan. Anthony?
Thank you, Chair. And I'd also like to add my thanks and congratulations to both John and Raymond on a fantastic achievement. I've certainly enjoyed working with John on enforcement cases in the last few months. I feel for the first time that the council has really proactively assisted councillors and residents with enforcement cases, and I'm really grateful that the team have done that. So I suppose my question is, how have you done it? Is it simply having more people, you get through more cases, or is there something more subtle than that? And secondly, is more something that I hope maybe to feed into the new local enforcement plan, which is a lot of the things that ordinary people think of as enforcement are actually handled by different departments at the council. So some enforcement matters, for example, suspended bays for skips and things like that are actually traffic and highways. Noise might be a planning condition, or it might be environmental health if there's no planning condition on noise. And then there are the more traditional enforcement issues as well. But for an ordinary person, they don't care. They just know there's a problem and they want help. At the moment, they need to have a map as to how to navigate the council systems to get there. And I wondered if that's something we can address in the new enforcement plan. You shouldn't have to be an expert on which department does what in order to get some help. And it's hard enough for a councillor and practically impossible for a resident.
Thanks, Anthony. And then Martin.
First, I'd just like to obviously welcome the reduction that has taken place in terms of the backlog. I just obviously saw 3.4, there has been obviously a reduction in the capacity of the team recently. Is this likely to lead to an increase in the numbers given capacity issues? And the other thing I obviously like to raise is the recruitment of staff. This is a very challenging area to recruit, like planning officers and agency staff having to be taken in from outside. Is there any way that things like salaries, upskilling could be looked at in order to address these capacity issues? Because obviously we would like to have permanent staff instead of agency staff working for the council, but sometimes unfortunately it is more attractive for agency staff in terms of that flexibility for them and for this area than actually recruitment of permanent staff, where there are, as we know, long endemic issues across the board when it comes to planning. And obviously in terms of this area, what other liaisons going on with other in terms of tackling this issue more at a national level, because we know it does exist and it is a big issue for local councils across the board.
Thanks, Martin. And over to you, John.
Thank you very much for those questions, and also the kind feedback as well. That is really very appreciated. So in terms of going back to the questions, Councillor Holden's question about how many long-term cases do we have now? The reason we were able to bring the backlog down quite as we have is we took quite a ruthless approach, really, in looking at the cases, particularly the older ones. And we found in there a lot of duplication. We found in there cases that had been opened that shouldn't have been opened because they should have been referred out elsewhere, or they weren't really material planning enforcement issues. We also found that the cases were taking too long. And that's tricky, because the national guidance will tell you that officers should take a pragmatic approach and should try to negotiate and should try to resolve problems and not end up at appeal and not end up at court. But it was a case of needs must, really. So we came to the view that we needed to make decisions, and Raymond was key to this. We need to make decisions. Are we going to serve a notice here, or do we need to close the case? And we hadn't had a manager for a while, from what I can gather, and the staff weren't quite sure of the direction around that, and Raymond spent a lot of time sat with them and going through them as how he thought things should be progressed or resolved. And so in terms of long-term enforcement cases now, I don't have an exact figure, but essentially we should not have any really that aren't in long legal proceedings or at appeal. So those old cases where there just needed a decision to be made by officers should essentially have been resolved now, and that's how we've managed to get about 600 closed. So, and then there was communication. Yes, that is something that we've been looking at with the auditors, and we realise that not everybody gets to find out the outcomes. We have some ideas around that, particularly involving members actually. So we are looking at, we've started the monthly updates and reports to the Planning Applications Committee. We're looking at quarterly newsletters for members, particularly about the higher profile cases. And we've also now included on the acknowledgement letters for all cases registered, the name and contact details of the case officer. So everybody always has somebody they can try and get hold of to get an update. So that wasn't the case previously. And also we have the enforcement officers on the duty rota, and Raymond's included in that actually. So during the afternoon, 1 until 3, it should also be possible to get a hold of an enforcement officer by phone. But we're expecting some recommendations to come out of the audit around this, which we will take on board. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to say. And also we need to improve our communication system and our IT system. And we are part of the corporate project where we're looking at the potential replacement of our M3 software system. So all in all, yes, we're looking to be more proactive around our communications. It is difficult because we still have a limited number of staff, and I'll come on to that actually. So in terms of the staff, at present, yes, we are a little bit down because we did lose an officer, albeit that officer was part-time, so that might not be as bad as it seems. And yes, we have one officer who's at training once a week, but you'd expect to have the resilience to be able to train your officers. So that's something that we are managing. Like I say, at the moment, we're getting out as many cases as we are registering. We're getting them off the books and sorted out in the right way. So at the moment, I don't feel that workload's increasing or that the officers are under too much pressure. I think that 300 to 350 cases is a reasonably healthy position for Merton to be in. We do have quite a few contractors at all levels, but they are contractors who've been with us a long time, and they have the money. Yes, the salaries do come into it, although there are a number of factors as to why those staff haven't necessarily become permanent yet. I'm working on that. We're looking at potential solutions. We're looking about being pragmatic and flexible with that. We would rather have permanent staff than agency. We are offering, various training benefits and supporting that. We are looking to try and promote the officers. I would like to have a principal enforcement officer, which we don't at the moment. So there'll be a career opportunity for somebody there. And in terms of the salaries, at the moment, yes, our budget is a problem, and to have the success we've had with the backlog has cost us, and other authorities haven't done that, and that needs addressing. Now, that is a national problem again. I'm relieved that the government is now consulting on increasing planning application fees. Every planning department's been waiting for that for a long time. There's talk of, what's been consulted on is a 35% increase in fees for major applications and 25% for minor applications and other applications, which will bring in some much needed increased income. And I'm hoping that it's been suggested that could be ring fenced for planning departments. That will help us make us become more competitive in terms of salaries. And yeah, it would just boost the income for the service. And enforcement, I imagine, will be very much part of that, because more robust planning enforcement is another reform to the national framework that's been consulted on. So for me, it's all linked, and that gives us something to work towards. I'll be responding to that consultation shortly. It's open until April, so we'll see where that takes us. In terms of how we've done it, the question by Councillor Fairclough, really, yes, we've been prepared to bring in the extra staff, the agency staff. The new manager has put a huge amount of effort into it. It's been very impressive with reducing the backlog. Like I say, we've taken a tougher approach and done less negotiation. The longer term plan around the draft enforcement plan will be to return to more negotiation in line with national guidance, but the priority was the backlog, and that's the direction that we've set. I would like to talk to the new executive director and the cabinet member around the new staff structure, and particularly how my staff may sit with under other regulations and the functions under them as well. I think that all authorities, because of financial resources, have to consider the potential of pooling of staff in certain ways to boost resources that way and address the priorities. And that would help as well in terms of under which regulations do which problems sit. So I think that's something we need to investigate further, and that's why at the moment the report is on hold, so we can look at that in more detail. I think it would be unwise not to. And that will enable us to implement the new enforcement plan. And again, I'd like to run the terms of that by the new executive director and the cabinet member. And any suggestions around that, I've had some helpful ones already from members. Any suggestions you have that you would like for consideration in that new draft enforcement plan will be very welcome, and we'll look to try and include those. And yeah, I think I've tried to cover everything there. Sorry, was there any other questions?
I think you have. I think that was very comprehensive. I think we might do one more round of questions for John, and then move on just with the interest of time. So I know Jill has a question. Other Victoria, yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question, or is it just Jill? Great, over to you, Jill.
So, thank you, Chair, and thank you, John. I have to say, you had an unenviable inheritance there when you took on the post, and as with everything you do, I mean, you know, pragmatic, getting on with the job with a smile on your face. I mean, I have to say that you're a breath of fresh air. But what I have to also say is that, you know, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, you are making huge progress in the backlog, this has been a classic example to me of how officers and councillors cooperate. And I think it's really important that this is a great example of where us on the ground can feed into you and say, we've got this problem. And you can say, well, actually, these are the options we've got. And the example I would cite is one of my decades-long problems in terms of the Burnbullock site. We've made more progress in the last 4 months than they've made in 15 years. And I can only say that is as a result of John and Raymond listening to me, getting in there very quickly. I mean, my calls are returned within half an hour. That's how prompt you are, which is to be commended. But also, I would say, and I would encourage other council members, I've gone on site visits with John and Raymond onto the Burnbullock with them we've looked, we've been inside the property, we've talked to people, we've gained knowledge that otherwise we may not have done. And I think there's a learning in there for us as councillors where it is appropriate. And I don't know if John would probably approve of it, but I think, you know, as councillors, it is an education. And where appropriate, it might be interesting for other councillors who have got long-standing issues with buildings or whatever to become more involved in that aspect. But I really have to say, you know, hats off to you and your team, and I'm delighted at the progress we're making in my ward. I mean, it's not just the Burn Bullock. Thank you very much.
John, would you like to respond to those words of kindness, or you can just let them sit as well?
Thank you very much again. No, that makes it all worthwhile. And high-profile cases, we are always happy to visit them with members. That is absolutely fine. I'll be doing a presentation at the next planning applications committee a week tomorrow night, actually, to talk about that Burn Bullock site visit, actually, and Hannah Doody joined us as well. And it was really helpful to have the support of the senior management and members there as well, and to get that local knowledge when we were actually at the site. And it's obviously a big problem that needs addressing, but your support would be appreciated, of course.
Thanks so much, John. And I don't know if there's any final thoughts. Caroline will give it the last two questions from you think, and also keep it brief, so I'm going to go for a break in a second. So go to Caroline and then
yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to John and Raymond as well, because they've helped me out with some cases in my ward of Ravensbury that I'd been struggling with for a few months and a few weeks, and we've got them resolved. And yeah, it's really good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just was interested in how you deter breaches, like what your interaction is with developers to stop, you know, to reduce the number of things that come to the need for enforcement, essentially. You know, is it about highlighting really successful enforcement cases to show how heavy you are and coming down on any breaches? I'm just, yeah, really interested to understand how you reduce the need for enforcement in the first place.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really good question. And actually, as part of our new enforcement plan, and actually as part of the reforms around the national framework, that there is a lot of talk about how enforcement can be more proactive. We are still, I have to say, largely reactive. We really do rely on members of the public. We do rely on them to keep us informed. And actually, I recall actually the question from Councillor Fairclough as well about how how residents can get into the system and navigate it easily, and how we can decide who's going to deal with a particular issue. One thing I would always encourage is that we don't often get huge amounts of evidence to help us there and then with an initial desktop exercise. So there's also some guidance in the draft enforcement plan about submitting as much information as possible. Photographs, you can't beat them, you know, we can never have enough photographs as well, but there's also the date on which an alleged breach happened. If we could have the exact address, believe it or not, we don't always get that. Details of the person responsible. We'll keep the details of the complainant confidential. That won't be an issue. And we just need to know the exact nature of the activity and the effect that the alleged breach is having. And we don't always get the explanation, and we get challenged on this when we enter the legal processes. We don't always get the explanation from residents what the actual impact is. So we get told what's happening, but not what the problem is as such. So is it a noise issue? Is it an odour issue? Is it a loss of light? Is it loss of character to the area? We're not always absolutely clear on that. So it does take us time to get to the bottom of that. But we will try and make more guidance available on the website. And in terms of being proactive, I have to say that with most of your regular developers, if something's brought to our attention, we do try and build up a network in that we can get on the phone quickly and informally. And developers who want to work with us, they'll sometimes acknowledge, right, okay, we've got something wrong here. And we do get on the phone and get out to site quickly all the time. And just by being willing to have those informal conversations, explaining the problem and encouraging a quick resolution, we do solve a lot that way as well. But yeah, there's more we can do to be proactive. The problem is always resources.
Right. Well, thank you very much, John. And if no other thoughts, yeah, I'll just add my name to the choir of commendations going away and the great work that you've done and the interactions that I've had with you. So I think we're going to take a short break now and return at 1:45. So thanks so much. You'll be back in 9 minutes. Thanks. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're now going to move on to our next item on retrofitting. And so I don't know who wants to introduce it. Should I pass over to Natasha? Natasha, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And can I just put on record my thanks to John Berry as well, because he genuinely is a superstar and a brilliant officer, and thank you for helping with this patch of land in my ward. Anyway, I'd like to turn to the report on retrofitting, and I'd like to thank Dominique, Amy and Tara, the officers responsible for pulling this together, who have been leading the climate response in our borough and have been doing an amazing job. So the report outlines that we since declaring our climate emergency in 2019, we've set out a climate strategy and action plan every year, and it highlights some of the work we've been doing to retrofit buildings in the borough. When we declared our climate emergency and issued our action plan, we highlighted how the majority of emissions come from buildings through heating and electricity usage in the borough. It's estimated that 74% of the borough's emissions comes from buildings and energy. So decarbonising our stock is going to be essential to us reaching our 2050 target borough-wide and our 2030 target as a council. It will cost a lot of money and a lot of effort to decarbonise every building in the borough. It's approximately about £2.8 billion, which we don't currently have, obviously. And it will take a significant effort for us to work in partnership with residents and organisations like UK Power Network and housing associations, because we don't own our own housing stock. So the report sets out the progress we've made and future plans for decarbonisation of the council's own building, including community schools, as well as homes and businesses. This includes climate funding that we allocated to support this work. So in 2021, Cabinet agreed a first kind of tranche of £2 million towards climate funding, and that went towards primarily expanding resource and capacity within the council, so hiring of community retrofit officers and hiring a building surveyor for council buildings, and to ensure we could enforce maximum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector. The second tranche of £2 million that we agreed in Cabinet in February 2023, that's going towards support for businesses. So we're looking to do a retrofit support scheme for businesses, looking at doing a retrofit loan scheme for residents, because there's funding available if you're on the lower income scale, and obviously if you're quite wealthy, you can afford to retrofit, but for people who are kind of caught in between those two stools, there's not much support. So we're looking to plug that gap with with a loan scheme ourselves, and we've got a range of activities to inform the council's own decarbonisation plans as well. So in parallel with this work, officers will be developing a retrofit strategy and energy master plan to help facilitate and support borough-wide retrofit by 2050. Officers intend to undertake intensive engagement and with key stakeholders over the coming year to inform our retrofit strategy and energy master plan and ensure the community buys into what we're trying to achieve. Council progress is and will continue to be monitored within the Merton's annual climate delivery plan, and key progress and priorities for borough-wide retrofit and decarbonising the council's estate are set out in work streams 2 and 6 of the delivery plan respectively. So I won't take up too much time speaking on the report, because I know that you've probably all read it, so happy to answer any questions, and looking forward to a discussion on where we are.
Thanks so much, Natasha. I just want to ask if Dominique or Tara have anything to add, or you happy to go straight to questions? Great. So are there any questions? You go to James, and then Dan, and then other Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll keep my question short and to the point. I'd like to just say what excellent and comprehensive report it is. The LED rollout has been successful and positive and shows that we can be prudent and sustainable at the same time. But I'd like to ask, how much is estimated to be saved financially in the next few years?
Thank you. And then if I can go to Dan.
Yes, thank you. Schools have a big problem, big buildings, and big sort of carbon leak and heat leak. How many more schools do you plan to do this year and next with either LED or insulation or other measures?
Dan.
I've got a few questions, that's okay, but following up on Dan's one, I had a similar question, but I wanted to ask about academy status. How does academy status impact whether a school gets capital funding from the council, and whether that muddies the waters at all? I also wanted to ask about on page 10.7 that we talk about the draft local plan as one of the ways we'll be encouraging better design. Can an officer or someone else give an example of what kind of things will be in a new local plan that will encourage better designs, that will ensure better energy efficiency? And one more for now, if that's okay. On page 11, and forgive me if I'm ignorant here, I'm not too sure how a combined heat and power unit works, but for me, burning gas to make electricity doesn't seem like a very net zero kind of thing when there's better ways to generate electricity. So can someone tell me how burning gas for electricity is a good thing to do?
I'm going to go to Natasha first to answer the ones you can, and then bring on officers if needed.
I don't have the financial savings that are coming from our LED, so I might turn to officers for that one. In terms of schools, we're reviewing, we've done the kind of first pass and we've gone back and reviewing where else we can add value. So I know that there's a couple of schools that we think we can get some solar panels put onto. In terms of academy status, I'm not entirely sure actually. That's a really good question. And I'm sure an officer can answer that. And then I had the same question down around the CHP thing as well. And I think we did put it in the report as to why it's better. But again, I'll let an officer just add the detail.
Thank you, councillors. In terms of the LED street lights, I think maybe 6 years ago we refitted a lot of the council street lights to LED. We left some untouched because actually they were fairly new anyway. They didn't need replaced at that point. We've got additional investment now because those street lights are now needing to be retrofitted to be able to put into LED. That'll take the borough's lighting stock to about 97% LED, so it will achieve savings. Probably about 6 years ago when we embarked on the street light and LED swap out, that was to achieve financial savings. It did, and they were reflected in highways budget. I don't know the exact figures on me now, but I can share them. What I will say is in the last year, 18 months, it's not savings. With the energy price increase, the street lighting budget is way higher than it ever has been. So to some extent, the LED savings have helped achieve savings in the past. They maybe held at bay the rise in energy at the moment. So we hope that may decline over time, but I can send the figures on if you want.
Thank you, Chair. In response to Councillor Johnson's questions, or two of Councillor Johnson's questions, and I'll pass over to Dominique for the third. Yes, with academy schools, the council works with the academy. It will depend on the particular school whether the council is obligated to undertake physical infrastructure repairs with the buildings. So there's definitely, it's definitely easier with the council's community schools to undertake retrofitting activities. In some cases, the council will receive the buildings when the academy contract finishes, and it could be in 10 years' time. So that means that we do need to keep working with the academy schools to undertake works and to persuade the Academy Trust to allow us to undertake certain works with them. In response to Councillor Johnson's question about the CHP units, and that's paragraph 211 of the report, yes, the intention is to phase out the gas-fired CHP at the Civic Centre. It was installed quite a number of years ago, I think about a decade ago. And yes, as time has moved on, CHPs are now moving more towards things like air source heat pump CHPs. So yes, as stated at point 2, we will need to phase out gas out of the heating system, and that's what we're working towards. I'll pass over to Dominique for the question about the local plan.
Thank you very much. Just to add a couple of points regarding schools, Councillor Ryan's mentioned that the council is looking at additional potential for solar PV across the community schools, and the council recently commissioned a new solar PV consultant, so they'll be looking at that, which will hopefully see some positive things. Another thing to mention on that point is, as set out in the appendix to the report, 100k has been allocated to a review of community schools heating and catering systems. So that's something that will happen this year, which will help inform works to community schools across the borough. On the local plan front, so the London Energy Transformation Initiative published a climate emergency design guide a few years ago, and the 3 key things that they're really recommending, and this is reinforced by the Committee on Climate Change as well, the 3 things that we need to see in new development to make sure that it's compatible with operating at net zero carbon by 2050 is that the buildings need to be very, very energy efficient. They need to use low carbon heat, and they need to maximize renewable energy generation on site. And these are 3 things that we're really trying to drive forward with our new draft local plan policies. So we're looking to introduce a new metric to better measure and monitor the efficiency of buildings. So it's an energy use intensity target. We're also requiring low carbon heat in all new development, and also looking to maximize renewable energy, so particularly through solar PV on site. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Anthony, John and Martin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for the report. I think my comment and question about this is it's a list of lots of great actions that we're carrying out and lots of good things that are going on. But I can't see how the effectiveness of any of these, I mean, you clearly have the detail, but I can't see here how the effectiveness of any of these things is reported back on. And that makes our job in scrutiny sort of practically impossible. We can't scrutinize something if we don't know, what the effect of any of these things is. So, for example, para 2.10, what are the details and what's the measure of effectiveness? And I've got a whole host of paragraphs I could say the same of. So I suppose my question is, you obviously have that information. Where can we see that information? And actually, this is possibly one for the panel to reflect on for the future. If we want to scrutinize something, we need to decide what it is we're scrutinizing. We're not really scrutinizing a list of activities that sound fantastic, but we've absolutely no idea what the effect of those things is.
Yeah, my question is more about sort of a roadmap for residents who are wanting to retrofit. There was one I know who wanted to install an air source heat pump, and they said you had to go for a noise assessment, which they went for and cost them about £1,500, and discovered that it was too noisy and they couldn't fit one. So it was a waste of that amount of money, which seems a bit of a waste. And also in terms of fitting solar panels to people's houses, is there any kind of shortcut way through the planning system? Because at the moment, I believe you have to have planning permission to fit solar panels. So is there any way we can look at making that easier for people to do?
Right, Martin.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask for more information in terms of 2.21, developing a retrofit strategy for the borough, covering the next 27 years. Clearly, this will be a huge thing, and a lot of it is obviously funding dependent. We know, obviously, in terms of this area, the council has put resources in as well, but it will require obviously additional funding from government to make many of these things possible, especially obviously as residential buildings are the biggest challenge in terms of retrofitting. We have seen some started by Clarion, but it's a huge job obviously across the board. When is this strategy likely to be published? And obviously, I think, from a scrutiny perspective, I think it would be good, obviously, if we could see this strategy and obviously, make comments on it. But I think we have to be also aware that, as it says here, you have obviously the political technology and funding availability, does change, and that will over the 27 years, but it's a huge thing, obviously, in terms of the council's own decarbonisation strategy, but also as well the wider strategy out there, and having a plan for that. But also as well, I think in terms of the jobs that can be created, green jobs, green jobs is going to be a huge growth area. Obviously, how can the council do this in terms of obviously upskilling people, working with employers across the borough, so that people do have the skills to take on this job, because this will be a huge growth area, but also as well a very important area going forward. So obviously I'd like comments, observations on those points. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Martin. If I can go back to Natasha, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. So, Anthony, I don't disagree with you. I think I mean, even as cabinet member, it's hard for me to stay on top of where we are. There's lots of things going on and there's lots of moving parts. What we've just done is published a pared down version of the climate delivery action plan. So that's online now, and it's got 2 graphs on there where it kind of plots out kind of our carbon emissions as a council and as a borough. The problem we have is there's a bit of a lag in the data that we get back that monitors that output. So there's a bit of a lag of a couple of years, but I still think it's important to, when we get it, to publish it. So our intention is to every year publish a pared down version of that big weighty tome that is the delivery plan, so everyone can kind of see where we are. There might be times when things spike in there where we've suddenly added in other things within that, but I think that scrutiny would be a time in which we would talk about where something has maybe spiked, or what if a measurement has suddenly changed. We'd pick that up here, but I agree, having sight of kind of what's the overarching measure, I think it is really important, and we're trying to find a way of doing that. I think in the report, so to John's question, yes, we are. So in the report, it talks about some funding that we've bid for, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say, but we are on our way to having a retrofit roadmap. We are working with the South London Partnership on that, because it's really important for us to work at a regional level, not just kind of at a borough-wide level. So we're going to have a retrofit roadmap specifically to help the private homeowners who need support and guidance on how to retrofit your property. I think there's very little direction you can be. You might have all the good intentions, but actually at the moment, for the feedback we get from, say, our climate action group at the moment, is that it's a minefield and you just don't know where to start. You don't know what suppliers to trust. So we're in the process of doing that, and that's going to be hopefully a good place for our residents to start. In terms of the retrofit strategy, so we've really only just kind of got up to capacity in terms of having retrofit officers that can lead this work. So I don't know the actual time frame as to when we'll finally have something we can present to you, but I would be more than happy to bring it back to scrutiny. The question around funding is, I mean, look, councils are always talking about, we're always talking about funding. My entire time as being a councillor has been talking about how much money we don't have. But I think when it comes to retrofitting, it really is a case of we do need a national oomph put behind this. If we need £2.8 billion to retrofit every building in Merton, then you scale that up across the country, we've got a big issue. But there are opportunities in that, as you kind of rightly said, Martin, in terms of green jobs and the partnerships that we can develop through working with the South London Partnership again, and working with South Thames College and the Towards Employment team to fill those roles that we desperately need in Merton. At the moment, I find really, I've said to Dominique and to Tara, I find it so hard to keep track of the pots of funding that we're bidding for, and this one is for this couple of million here and a couple of million there. It's just not very joined up, and it takes a lot of officers' time, and it doesn't feel like this is a national response. It feels really bitty, and it doesn't feel like it's something that's serious. So yes, I think it's going to continue to be a challenge, and I think that our officers are doing a really great, amazing job actually of staying on top of everything that we're allowed to bid for. And if we're not allowed to bid for it, there's funding for things like for housing associations that our officers have been really crucial in flagging to housing associations and in supporting their bids into those pots of funding as well.
Officers want to add anything? Yeah, Tara?
Just very briefly to echo Councillor Irons in response to Councillor Fairclough. In section 12 of this report, there's a link to the website, and that provides both the really detailed climate delivery plan for year 3, which sets out pretty much project by project what's going on, looking back over 2022, looking forward for 23, and as Councillor Irons said, a summary version, which is a good deal shorter and easier to digest. And on the retrofit strategy, as Councillor Irons said, we'd be happy to come back to scrutiny. And as all the questions echo around the room, it's such a complex beast. It includes skills, learning, retrofitting buildings, how to do it, what technologies to use. And we must make sure we bring everybody in the borough with us when we're doing that, rather than write a council strategy and publish it and not bring people with us, because we have to work collaboratively, because we don't own buildings ourselves, or not enough of them. So we'd be more than happy to come back at a suitable time in the scrutiny calendar.
Thank you. Now I know Jill has a question. Dan, any other questions? Victoria, is there anyone else who might make the final round? Cool. Great. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Councillor Irons and the team. This is a massive challenge, and I don't envy the amount of work you're having to put into this, but eternally grateful. But I have a question which you may not be able to answer this evening, but I think is worth taking back and discussing potentially with John Berry and his team with regard to solar panels in a conservation area. At the moment, we have very strict laws surrounding what we can and can't do in a conservation area. But I do have a case of one resident who was willing to and put in an application to have solar panels put on her house. And it was rejected out of hand because it's a conservation area. I would suggest that we need to seriously think locally and nationally about how we soften our approach to encourage, our aims in terms of reducing, carbon, et cetera, our carbon footprint. We need to take a look at how we can encourage folk to use solar panels where possible, obviously not willy-nilly. And clearly, if it's a listed building we're dealing with, depending on whether it's a public building or someone's house, we need to think carefully. We need, if we haven't already got it, some kind of local strategy. You may be able to sort of elucidate further on that, but that would be my hope, is we could look at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Please.
I wanted to ask about the energy master plan that's referenced in 2.20. So I note that currently the national grid would not sustain 100% conversion to electricity, and so a master plan needs to be drawn up. But what do we know? What is a tipping point? At what point does the national grid fail? And in terms of creating an energy master plan, what is the time frame for this? When are we expecting there to be a better idea about what will be required in terms of national grid infrastructure upgrades? And secondly, I was heartened to read in paragraph 2.39, page 17, about Merton Council being a leader amongst local authorities in supporting residents to make applications by using the not-for-profit Thinking Works. I know there are 461 applications that were made. How many of them were supported by Thinking Works?
Next, Dan, if I go to Victoria.
Thank you. Excuse me. For 2.42, the loans for able to pay residents, I was just interested to understand how that amount was kind of set aside for that scheme. What are the kind of objectives? Is it number of houses? Is there specific types of retrofitting that the loan scheme will support versus others it wouldn't? It'd just be great to understand a bit more about what it hopes to achieve with that amount of money.
Thank you. Over to you, Natasha.
Okay, so I'm going to have to the solar and conservation areas. Yes, it's a tricky one, and I have to be honest and say I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that so much, and perhaps I need to. I don't know how. Maybe we need to look at. I don't know if John's still here. Maybe we can do. Maybe John can give us some advice on what we could possibly, what the art of the possible is with this.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean that's an issue that's been looked at right at the national level at the moment. Of course, what's permitted development and what isn't is set at the national level. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But we can respond to the consultations on that and then see how we can draw that down to a more local level. But it is being looked at the moment at a very high level.
Yeah, I mean it could be. I know that in places, I think I saw a documentary on about in Portugal, in some of the most beautiful places where they've got ornate tiles. Some of them are actually solar panels as well. So maybe there's something around the design of solar panels fitting into conservation areas. But again, that's a national discussion. Dan, in terms of energy master plan, it's again, we've only really kind of just got up to capacity in terms of us having people physically in the building to do this work. So we'll come back to you with a timeline, and maybe we can come back again with a bit more detail as to what's in that master plan. I don't know at what the tipping point is, but I do know that so we're looking at things like decarbonising our waste fleet. We have to go to UK Power Networks and say, how do we electrify Garth Road, or how do we use other means? And it's a big discussion and a bit of attention, and I know other councils have struggled to get the infrastructure they need without having to pay for it themselves, and not getting the support from the other side. So again, it comes down to money, which is unfortunate, because you would have thought that's something we could on a national level kind of solve anyway. In terms of the number for Thinking, so Thinking, I don't know if it's unclear, but Thinking Works are the company that physically do the work. So the scheme is the Mayor's Warmer Homes Fund, so he's got a pot of money, and then they commission Thinking Works to do the work. We've paid a little extra, I think, to support some of our most vulnerable residents to do where you have people who don't necessarily want someone to come into their house, and are a bit kind of resident, they're a bit worried about it. We've paid for a little bit of extra funding to help ease that process and to explain what's going on a bit more. And I think that's part of the reason our applications have been higher, and we've been a bit of an exemplar council in terms of our communication about this scheme. And we've also used our carbon offset fund to top up funding to make sure that this work can go ahead. So we'll get final stats on how many properties that actually get work done. We'll have those stats at some point, which we'll be able to share. But I think it's really testament to the work of officers in Merton and kind of the priorities of the administration, in that we want to help people not only cut their carbon emissions, but help save them money in a time when money is extremely tight. And then Victoria, the question about the loan scheme, I think so that's based on us thinking about the amount of properties we have, but then also thinking about the other things we wanted to do with that money. So we're also trying to support businesses with that money, where we're trying to restart. So we've got the loan scheme is one thing, but then the businesses, when we looked at our delivery plan, we realised there was a big gap where we hadn't really engaged with businesses and supported them. So we wanted to have a scheme for them where we could do assessments of what they needed, and then also start a grant scheme for them to be able to apply for support to help retrofit their buildings. So the 2 million was divided between those kind of two priority areas, really, kind of the kind of can pay market, and also the business supporting businesses, because we didn't have a lot of support there. We are looking at other ways of doing those, of supporting business, and seeing if we can bid for other funding, because I know that if we can release that funding, we can then push it back into other things. So we'll keep looking at it.
Any final things to say on this? Oh, sorry, well, Dominique, over to you.
Sorry, I was just going to add a couple of points there. So as Councillor Ryan said, we're just starting to look at the energy master plan, and one of the really important things that we want to do this year, which would feed into your question, Councillor, is we very much need to engage with UK power networks and other kind of key stakeholders in the borough to get a better understanding of what the local pressures on the local grid will likely be. So those will be really key conversations in informing exactly the questions that you were asking. And just to add on the Thinking Works front, just to say that the current numbers that we have is that they've supported to date with 180 applications for low-income homes. But this is an ongoing process, so the scheme is still running until October of this year. So it's really, really great. We're extremely grateful for that local support, and we really are seeing some really positive outcomes of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might then go to Stephen for the final word on this.
I'm not sure it'll be worth waiting for, but so first thing I'd like to say to the officers and to the cabinet member is compliments for your efforts and achievements. Thank you very much. I would add to that, thank you for writing it in a form that I can easily read, which makes a great deal of difference when you've been doing as much reading as we've all been doing recently. But it was really only to sort of follow up a point that was made earlier on. I note that we've got key performance indicators elsewhere, and that there's lots of them, and it's very, very detailed and difficult area, but it's really quite difficult for us to have to go away and look at all the key performance indicators to then be able to scrutinize whether this is going well or not. I mean, my request stroke recommendation for us to consider would be that there are some key performance indicators that the cabinet member or the officers might suggest are significant and worthwhile hearing about, and that we're told what those are and we come back and look at them at some point, rather than simply know that there are lots out there if we want to go and look at it.
I might maybe go to Natasha for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
As well.
Yeah, I get to practice as well as I go over to the officers and to kind of like, because these are conversations we've been having, excuse me, ourselves, just to make this feel a bit more tangible and a bit more visible. I think that's what I'm really keen to do, is just make this feel, because it feels really big and it feels really overwhelming, and you feel like you're not actually getting anywhere. So how do we make this feel like it's an achievable thing? And we have made a stab at it with the graph I mentioned earlier, but perhaps we can include that in every report that we bring back to you. We can include that top line, kind of what our carbon outputs are as a borough and as a council. And it might not move, because as I said, that there's a lag in the information we get, so it might not look very different every single time we bring a report, but it could still just be there front and center for you. Alternatively, you've got a basket of performance indicators. If it's around, like, I don't know what the practicalities of us saying, when we've done our climate delivery plan every year, we just pull out those key stats and then maybe have a kind of basket of indicators that we just give you the key stats and not the whole report or something. But I totally get that you need to be able to see where we're heading, and if we're on track, and that helps us, because if there are things that we could need some more support on, if there's things that we need to think about differently, that is obviously what Scrutiny is for. But yeah, I'll throw over to Tara and to Dominique, who we've been having these conversations, so what we can practically deliver for people, they can advise on.
Thank you. I think just to echo lots of stuff that Councillor Ryan's there, and we can definitely take this away. And I think it's something that we'll consider as we're developing the retrofit strategy this year, is how we monitor progress. Obviously, Councillor Ryan's and Tara have mentioned that we have the climate delivery plan at the moment, which has indicators for various work streams, but also the greenhouse gas inventory updates. And that's where Councillor Ryan's mentioned there's this lag between the data and the action that's happening. So I think that's something that we can look at this year, is how we monitor progress against that retrofit strategy moving forward, and what information we bring to you as Scrutiny.
Sorry, I know I have a question. I just quickly so what I understood from Stephen's recommendation was, obviously each time we have a meeting we get the performance monitoring indicators, for all sorts of things, for waste and whatnot. I think how practical is it or feasible would there be for a particular piece of data to be included in that would kind of reflect where with the direction we're moving on particular items? I guess is that something that is practical, or do we not have is the information not up to date enough, or would it be too much work to bring that together for each meeting? Just how practical would something like that be?
It really depends on the piece of data, Chair. So if it, for example, is the number of low-income households that have applied for the funding by the deadline of October, of course, we can bring it back to you regularly. If it's something like the impact that that has on greenhouse gas in the borough, there will be a very complex piece of work that would take a long time to pull that together in amongst a much wider climate strategy, because we're just looking at retrofit here. So I think it probably is something, if you don't mind, if we take it away and get back to you on. And of course, we will bring the retrofit strategy and potentially climate delivery plan year 4, which is coming up this year, back to yourselves. And we could focus on information then as well.
Chair, could I make a suggestion as well? Like, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. You know, maybe it would be helpful to understand what it is you think would be helpful for us to bring. And then we can tell you, we can have a think about how we would do that. And if it's not possible, then it's not possible. So I guess, is it just a case of the number of council buildings that have been retrofitted, or is it our greenhouse gas inventory? Yes, maybe there's a bit of work that we could do through scrutiny to kind of just highlight what it is you would like to see.
I mean, Stephen, on that,
yeah, my thought is that the expertise on the answer to your question, Councillor, is within the officers as to what the most telling indicators will be. I mean, obviously, we could make up something now, but I'm perfectly happy for the officers to propose what 3 or 4 useful indicators would be that they think and you think are of interest to us, because we don't need to decide now. I think the most important thing, as you've indicated and the officers have indicated, this is something you've been thinking about anyway. You know what's important because you're working on it much more often than we are. But if you could have 3 or 4 indicators, we're much more likely to be able to look at them properly if there's only 3 or 4 than if there's 30 or 40.
Is your point on this? Yeah, cool.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'm sort of echoing the points that are being made, but it's actually a sort of more general point about when these kind of reports come to us. It's really useful if we're asked to scrutinise something, if there is some measure that we're scrutinising, and I think that's the point I was making, and possibly echoed slightly in Councillor Mercer's point. So I don't think we need to set, you know, measures that we want to see, even measures that we want to see every meeting, because I don't think we necessarily do. I just think it's when climate emergency, retrofitting, that kind of stuff comes to us, the feedback is actually we want to know how it's working and how effective it is. And the only additional point I'd add is if there are new initiatives, I think it's useful to have some idea of what you're hoping to see from them and or how it's working. So I certainly don't want to constrain or add to massive workloads to produce vast amounts of information for every meeting. But I just think next time something on retrofitting comes to us, it'd be useful to have you know, that sense of progress that you're making and how things are working, so we can scrutinise it. So if there's something that's really successful, we can see that, and if there's something that's less so, maybe we can feed back on that.
Natasha, maybe if I could bring you in on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I mean, I think, yeah, that's, I don't disagree with you at all. And as I said, how we make this tangible and how we make this feel a bit more, you know, a bit more wielded, a bit more kind of coherent. I totally get. Perhaps if we do, perhaps next time we bring you a paper, we'll think about, okay, so what is the one we can do? Because I think it was helpful for you to see the work that's going on and to see a lot of these projects that are happening, because it provides context, but also some of the things aren't necessarily going to be able to fit into a bucket of something or a stat. But this work is vital and is kind of getting us on a good stead. But perhaps if we had one stat that we could keep in mind at the front and center of every report we bring to you, then you can see what's kind of sitting behind that, maybe.
I mean, I think the sort of consensus, I think, would sort of be that, you know, when we have future reports come to us on sort of this, maybe if there is some way of kind of a sort of top line of kind of that allows us to measure that progress that's being made. So just a kind of general point that, you know, if we have things like this, it would be great to have something that's kind of measurable and that we could track over a period of time. So, I mean, I don't know if something like that for the future sounds like something you guys could do.
Yes, Chair. Okay.
Yeah. Great. Is any final points that I might move us on to the next item? So, if anything, if I could please, well, firstly, thank you very much, Natasha, and the officers very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And as I'd like to echo all the thoughts and praise that have gone your way for the work you've done on this. It really is excellent and very much appreciated. So with that, if I could now pass over to Stephen to talk about some of the work that he's been doing on his one-man task force.
Thank you, kindly, sir. Yeah, toilets in Merton, not perhaps the most glamorous of topics, but I'll have a stab at it. I did raise with yourself and with the chair of the Scrutiny Commission, Ed Foley, the question about whether I might look into the toilet provision that we have in Merton a few months ago, and you kindly agreed for me to take it on in the form of a rapporteur scrutiny inquiry, which is a one-person inquiry group, but I am supported by former councillor Peter Southgate, who knows far more about being a councillor than I'll ever know, I suspect. Rather than going on for ages, I'll just describe very quickly the problem. 40% decline in public toilet provision since 1999, probably exacerbated by the Disability Discrimination Act and also by the pandemic. Disability Discrimination Act, why that? Well, because a number of councils took the opportunity to close their toilets when they realised they'd have to invest quite a lot into them as a result of the Disability Discrimination Act. 91% of people don't feel the provision in their borough is adequate, according to the Greater London Assembly survey. 94% have difficulty finding a public toilet in an unfamiliar area of their borough. 56% of people restrict fluid intake due to concern over lack of toilet facilities, which leads to dehydration risk, according to the Royal Society for Public Health. Another good one is 1 in 5 of the general public say they're not able to go out as often as they would like because of concerns around a lack of public toilets. For those with an illness or a condition requiring more frequent toilet use, this figure rises to 43%, according to the same Royal Society for Public Health. So this limits the aged, those unwell with Crohn's disease, colitis and other ailments, women who are pregnant, families with young children who have to consider they're going to have to run somewhere quick when the 5-year-old needs a wee, outdoor workers, the homeless, those using public transport, those walking or cycling, active transport that we're all looking for. So the remit that I got agreement for, I've dropped in front of you so you can see what the remit is. Exploring awareness of toilet provision in Merton in general. We're mapping the existing provision. We're trying to learn people's perceptions of what we've got, looking at the direction of travel in Merton. We're exploring the barriers to extending the existing community toilet scheme. For those of you who don't know what the community toilet scheme is, it's a common way for councils to pass on the burden to retailers to provide toilets in their area. In Richmond, there's 70-something providers. In Lewisham, there's something like 72 providers. In Merton, there's 4, plus the Civic Centre, which closes at 5 o'clock, as far as I understand. And explore ways of creating greater awareness for the community toilet scheme, if that's what we decide we're going to carry on with, having done the survey. I asked that I might be able to do some focus groups, some desk research, which is largely being done by Peter and I, possibly get expert witnesses. Richmond have got their 70-something officers, so perhaps speaking to someone there, given they're part of the South London partnership as well. And we're also doing an online survey. That was what we wanted to do. So actions so far, we've done 4 focus groups, including the Merton Centre for Independent Living. We've had 2 small group surveys, including the community champions. We've launched the borough-wide survey, which started on Monday. It's being promoted in My Merton as of today or tomorrow, I think. And there's an email alert going out as well. The consultation is available if you look on merton.gov.uk consultations, or if you stick public toilets into the search engine, or if you want to know, it's survey number 928, if you manage to remember that. Discussion with retail representatives. We've already spoken to Love Wimbledon. We're hoping to speak to Ely's, Centre Court, hoping to speak to the business associations in Rains Park and Wimbledon Village to give us the perspective of the commercial perspective of toilet providers, people who've actually got the toilets, and how they feel about them being used by everyone. Actions to come. We'll hopefully have the results of the survey by the end of this month, beginning of next. I'm hoping to talk to Councillor Stringer and Councillor McCabe in the next few weeks. We'll obviously consolidate all the data once we've got the results of the survey, and we'll start drafting proposals with a view to submitting those in early May. And then we'll finalise a report and submit it for approval by yourselves at our next meeting, which, unless you folks decide differently, is in June, as far as I'm aware. Feel free to shoot if you've got. I've got one last line, because this is a good one for trying to persuade businesses. 81% of people are more likely to visit shops and cafes in the area if the toilet provision were better, per Age UK.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stephen. And just to say, yeah, so 2 things. So one, can absolutely ask questions now. I know, like I said, we're going to be speaking at, you're going to be bringing all the stuff you've done so far to the next meeting, all the surveys and everything. But and the second thing was just to say what a fantastic job you've done on this. I mean, I know you've had some support elsewhere, but also the work you've done personally, I think has been really, really impressive. So we will have a chance at the next meeting to have some more thorough questioning when more data is available. But are there any questions right now, Anthony and Dan?
Thank you. It's not really a question, maybe more of a suggestion. There are a lot of toilets in our public open spaces that are either not accessible or intermittently accessible. So it might be worth talking to ID Verdi as well as one of the group of people, because they're often very reluctant to make their facilities available.
I also wanted to thank you for this excellent work, which I know has struck a chord with a lot of people that I know personally that need require ready access to public toilets. I was wondering if you give me a sneak preview as to why we have such poor retailer uptake for the community toilet scheme in Merton, as opposed to other boroughs.
Thank you. And then if I just go just quickly to Jill and then Martin.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Stephen. I say this with tongue in cheek. All this investigation into toilets is a dirty old business, but you've done well. And we thank you for it, because I actually took your survey and I thought it was very thorough and well thought out. And I hadn't heard of this scheme whereby one could potentially sort of use a loo because there's a sign on the door. So I really congratulate you on this piece of work. But it also reminds me of why some people don't even like to use public toilets, because back in the day in the 80s, I don't know if anyone else recalls, you're all probably much too young, at Covent Garden by the big church, I forget which one it's called, there used to be a fantastic underground public toilet, which was consistently manned by a lovely attendant, lots of flowers, it was incredibly clean, and unfortunately it no longer exists. But the reason people used it and there'd be queues out the door was not only the fact that it was convenient, pardon the pun, but also because it was exceptionally clean and well maintained. I wonder whether this is part of the problem, as even if you have a provision of a public toilet, the idea of actually going into it is pretty grim. And how would we get round that? I don't know if you have any sort of options, because obviously there will be a cost implication. But certainly, I think everything you're trying to do is absolutely spot on, particularly for people with illnesses and difficulties, bladder, incontinence and disabilities. I think you're absolutely on the right track, and I thank you for your work.
And then just finally, Martin.
I'd just also like to reiterate my thanks to Stephen for all his work. I mean, I think obviously in terms of council public toilets, most of them were shut down around the 80s and 90s because of the costs of maintenance and overheads was quite considerable. What did pop up in their place was some of these mobile, sort of where you put a coin in the toilet. They came up around the 80s, you know, after councils did shut them down. And yeah, there was, you know, when I was quite young, there was a lot more toilets, public toilets, but yeah, I think most of them have gone. I think obviously in terms of community provision, I think that's something that, you know, is welcome, obviously in terms of getting more involved. But another thing that I would probably say as well is that, you know, in terms of Australia, I don't know if you know, but Australia produces the National Public Toilet Map, which is part of the National Continence Programme. So across Australia, there's actually a map of where there is toilet provision, toiletmap.gov.au. You may want to look at that site. And I certainly think, you know, a map would be something that could be potentially looked at. This is, you know, an electronic one. But, you know, in terms of mapping out where there is provision, it's, you know, it's an amazing, you know, resource that it goes into that level of detail. I think it would be something that, yeah, I think it's something that, you know, whether there's a joined up approach, not just in Merton, but across London, but even if we could do it maybe on a local basis, you know, it's something I would ask that you maybe look at in terms of your provision, because we obviously there is a need for people to access toilets, and it is very difficult in many circumstances.
Thank you, Martin. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you all for your kind words. Obviously, I'm seeking glory and honour, and that's my main motivation. So I'm sticking to that line. If I may take it in reverse, simply quite a quick one. Thank you, Martin, for the suggestion. There is a Great British Toilet Map online available, but I was talking with Paul McGarry, who's kindly supporting us with the inquiry earlier on, and we were talking about potentially including information in the council's app, the My Merton app, which would seem a sensible place to put it. But also feeding into the Great British Toilet Map and to other things. So there will be multiple opportunities for people to find out, because there's clearly an issue about communication of the facilities that are available. And, you know, it's even one of the places I would refer you to if you wanted to have a look at this exciting topic would be Lewisham Local, who a couple of years ago didn't have any community toilet scheme. In the last couple of years have galvanized and now have 73 participants in theirs. But they did it partly because they put some money behind it in the way of at least, I think, a half person per week, 20 hours a week community champion who went round and galvanized people to actually participate. Dan, tackling your question, historically, because we looked at when the scheme was set up here. When it was set up here, it was considered that Wimbledon didn't really need to participate because they had great toilet provision anyway. So they didn't participate in the community toilet scheme. I'm not sure what happened in Mitcham, but there appears to be maybe one, if not none there. Nothing in Collier's Wood, nothing in Rains Park, and I think 3 here in Morton. I think that the payment that we make for them is not huge. And I think we don't give them any encouragement. In Lewisham, they actually promote the businesses that have bought into the scheme. So they have their name up in lights on a website and it says, this business has all of these provisions, all of these facilities, and gives 10% off to people quoting community toilet scheme or that sort of thing. So everyone buys into it and everyone is encouraged to be seen as a community champion because they're helping the community. And that would be what I think, without actually committing myself to my recommendations, that would be one of the things I might be saying. I take on the point made by Jill that there is an issue about cleanliness and safeness of toilets. Certainly, I talked about this issue to one of my female friends, and she said, I never go to a public toilet because they're unseen, unsafe, and they're unclean. And I think that's certainly the perception that there was years ago in relation to public toilets. There's so few of them now, I'm not sure that perception still applies. That's one of the answers to the question why the community toilet scheme has been embraced by so many people, because those businesses then take care of the toilets that they provide. And Anthony, thank you for the suggestion. I may well contact them at least for a comment, but I think they may well come up with what Martin has said. In other words, you haven't got this in the contract that we've got with you. We'd have to spend money, and so we're not going to. But happy to have any more contributions or tips of Australian websites that any of you might want to give whilst I'm proceeding with things.
Well, yes. Thank you very much, Stephen. I suggest anyone just gets in touch directly with Stephen if they want to chat more. And like I said, we'll be discussing this in a bit more detail once you've had the full results later in June. So if I then just the final thing really to say is that so obviously right now we're looking at the work program for next year. So you all had an email looking at suggestions for topics. I'd say please do check that out. And there's also, you would have got looking at feedback on just the scrutiny process that I believe Stella sent around. So if everyone could please, have a look at that and fill that in, it does help to improve the scrutiny process. So I think with that, we have come to the end of our agenda. So just a huge thank you and also for all your time over basically the last month or so, where we've seen each other quite a lot. And I think next time we see each other will be on June the 7th. So thanks so much all. Have a good rest of your evening.